You don't belong here. What kind of mess are you causing now? The officer's voice cut through the stale air of the precinct, sharp with disdain and soaked in prejudice. His tone carried the arrogance of someone who believed they were untouchable, and his eyes scanned the woman before him with contempt, as though her very presence offended him. She stood tall, refusing to let the weight of his words make her shrink, but her calm composure only seemed to fuel his anger. The confrontation began with a misunderstanding, or perhaps it wasn't a misunderstanding at all. She had come to the station after being wrongfully detained, accused of something that didn't even make sense. The arresting officers claimed she matched the description of a suspect, a vague excuse that was all too common. She carried no weapon, no contraband, no evidence of any wrongdoing. Yet here she was, standing in the middle of a precinct filled with judgmental stares and whispering voices, facing the raw embodiment of unchecked authority. "What kind of trouble do you people always bring?" the officer sneered as he approached her. He was tall, his presence looming, and his uniform seemed to hang heavy with the power it represented. There was no hesitation in his movements as he crossed the room, stopping just inches from her face. His words were more than an insult, they were an attack, each syllable meant to degrade, to diminish. "I want to speak to someone in charge," she replied firmly, her voice steady and unwavering. Her tone carried a confidence that was unfamiliar in these walls, a sharp contrast to the usual submission they expected from someone in her position. She didn't yell. She didn't beg. She simply demanded the respect that should have been hers to begin with. But that demand was her first mistake, or at least, that's how the officer saw it. He laughed, a cold, humorless sound that echoed off the precinct's walls. "You think you can come in here and make demands?" His laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a snarl. "You don't tell me what to do. I tell you." Her silence was deafening. She stood her ground, her calm demeanor cutting through the hostility like a blade. But her resistance only seemed to pour gasoline on the fire. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm roughly, pulling her closer as he leaned in, his voice lowering to a venomous hiss. "Maybe I need to remind you who's in charge here." And then it happened. The blow came without warning, a sharp crack that reverberated through the room. Gasps echoed around them, the kind of reaction that came from witnesses who didn't know whether to intervene or turn away. The force of the punch sent her staggering backward, but she didn't fall. She caught herself, standing tall once more, her hand slowly coming up to touch the fresh bruise forming on her cheek. Her eyes burned, not with tears of pain, but with something far more piercing, rage. "Are you done?" she asked, her voice cold and cutting. Her calm demeanor had been replaced with something unshakable, a resolve so fierce that even the officer faltered for a moment. But he recovered quickly, straightening his posture, his chest puffing out as he sought to reassert his dominance. "You don't talk back to me," he barked, pointing a finger in her face. "You think you can walk in here and act like you're better than me? You're nobody. Just another troublemaker who needs to learn her place." The room was silent. The other officers stared, some with discomfort, others with barely concealed approval of the spectacle unfolding before them. Nobody stepped forward to stop it. Nobody spoke up in her defense. And then she smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of her lips that was more defiant than anything she could have said. That smile was a warning, though the officer didn't realize it yet. As the tension reached its breaking point, the doors at the far end of the precinct opened. A sharp voice rang out, cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. "What's going on here?" Every head turned. The officer, his back to the door, stiffened at the sound. The woman didn't answer, her eyes still locked on the man who had just struck her. "Explain yourself," the voice demanded again, closer now. There was no mistaking the authority in its tone. But it wasn't directed at her. It was directed at him. The officer turned slowly, his face already flushed with the beginnings of confusion. And as he faced the source of the voice, his expression shifted from irritation to disbelief. Because standing there, dressed in the crisp uniform of someone who outranked him by several levels, was the woman he had just struck. What happens next is a story of reckoning, of power turned on its head, and of justice served in a way that nobody in that precinct could have predicted. As the walls of power begin to crumble around the officer, the woman he sought to humiliate will rise, not just as a victim, but as a force to be reckoned with. How does a man who believed himself untouchable handle the realization that the person he tried to break now holds his career, his reputation, and his future in her hands? And how does she choose to wield that power? What choices will she make, and how far will she go to right the wrongs of that day? Stay with us to find out. The twists and turns of this story will leave you speechless. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. This channel is a safe space where we share stories that inspire, empower, and challenge injustice. To every Black viewer watching, know that you are seen, valued, and supported. Together, we can amplify the voices that deserve to be heard and fight for a world built on equality and respect. Enjoy the story, and if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our powerful narratives. Let's dive in. The precinct hummed with the kind of muted tension that only seemed to exist in places where authority hung heavy in the air. Officers moved through the fluorescent-lit hallways with purpose, their footsteps echoing on the polished tile floors. Desks cluttered with paperwork, half-empty coffee cups, and the occasional framed family photo filled the room with the messiness of everyday life. Despite the chaos, the air carried an unspoken order, a hierarchy that everyone understood without it needing to be said. At the center of it all stood Officer Rick Callahan, a man whose presence dominated any room he entered, not because of his stature, but because of the aura of control he projected. Rick was everything one would expect from someone who had spent the last decade climbing the ranks of law enforcement. His square jaw, neatly combed hair, and crisp uniform gave him the appearance of someone who demanded respect. To those who didn't know him well, he was the epitome of a model officer, disciplined, confident, and authoritative. But beneath the surface, there was a darker edge to Rick, one that many of his colleagues had chosen to ignore or quietly excuse. His reputation for being tough on suspects often crossed the line into something more sinister, though it was rarely spoken about openly. Some justified his actions as the necessary measures of a man who took his job seriously. Others simply didn't want to get involved. Rick thrived on the unspoken rules of the precinct, rules that allowed him to wield his authority unchecked. To him, the badge was more than a symbol of duty, it was a shield, one that protected him from consequences and gave him the power to impose his will on others. He took particular satisfaction in asserting that power over those he deemed problems, a term he often used to describe the marginalized communities he policed. His interactions were laced with microaggressions and outright hostility, but he always managed to stay just within the bounds of what could be excused or overlooked by his superiors. On the other side of town, life moved at a different pace. For Maya Jackson, the world didn't revolve around badges or authority, but around community and resilience. Maya had spent her entire career advocating for justice, first as a public defender and later as a federal investigator. She was a woman of sharp intellect and unwavering conviction, someone who had learned to navigate the fine line between determination and diplomacy. Her work had taken her to the front lines of some of the most contentious issues facing the justice system, from police reform to wrongful convictions. But despite her professional achievements, Maya had never lost touch with her roots. She remained deeply connected to her community, often volunteering at local shelters or mentoring young women who aspired to follow in her footsteps. Maya's upbringing had instilled in her a profound sense of purpose. Growing up in a predominantly Black neighborhood, she had witnessed firsthand the ways systemic inequality shaped lives and limited opportunities. Her parents, both educators, had always emphasized the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. That lesson had guided Maya throughout her life, fueling her passion for justice and her refusal to back down in the face of adversity. It was that same passion that had led her to accept a new position as the chief of police, a role that would place her in a position to effect meaningful change from within a system that desperately needed it. The precinct she was about to take charge of was infamous for its problems. It was a place where the thin blue line often felt more like a wall, separating officers from the communities they were meant to serve. Maya knew she was walking into a difficult situation, but she welcomed the challenge. Change was never easy, and she was prepared to face resistance. What she didn't expect, however, was that her first day would bring her face to face with the very culture she was determined to dismantle. Rick had no idea who Maya was when she arrived at the precinct. To him, she was just another suspect who had been brought in under vague pretenses. He didn't care about the details of her arrest, only that she was there and that she represented everything he resented: strength, defiance, and an unwillingness to be intimidated. Her calm demeanor only seemed to provoke him further, a silent challenge to his authority that he couldn't tolerate. He didn't see her as a person, only as a problem to be dealt with. The precinct itself was a reflection of its internal culture. The walls were lined with plaques and commendations, many of which bore the names of officers long retired. The break room was filled with stale coffee and worn-out furniture, a place where conversations often veered into territory that outsiders would find troubling. The officers who worked there were a mix of seasoned veterans and fresh recruits, some of whom carried a quiet disillusionment with the job, while others embraced the us versus them mentality that Rick embodied so completely. For Maya, walking into that precinct wasn't just about starting a new job, it was about stepping into a battlefield. She knew she would have to earn the respect of a team that wasn't accustomed to answering to someone like her. But Maya wasn't there to make friends or win popularity contests. She was there to lead, to set a new standard, and to hold those under her command accountable. What she didn't anticipate was that her first encounter with Rick would be a microcosm of everything she was fighting against. The arrest itself had been humiliating. Maya had been stopped while walking to her car after a late-night meeting. The officers claimed she matched the description of a robbery suspect, an excuse so flimsy it was almost laughable. Despite calmly explaining who she was and providing identification, they insisted on bringing her in for questioning. It was a clear abuse of power, one that spoke volumes about the biases that shaped their actions. As she sat in the precinct, waiting for someone to acknowledge the absurdity of the situation, Maya couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and sadness. Anger at the injustice she was experiencing, and sadness at how common this scenario was for so many others who didn't have the same resources or platform to fight back. She wasn't just thinking about herself, she was thinking about every person who had been silenced, dismissed, or mistreated in places like this. The stage was set. The lines had been drawn. Rick, with his arrogance and sense of invincibility, had no idea who Maya was or what she represented. And Maya, with her quiet strength and unshakable resolve, was about to show him, and everyone else in that precinct, that change was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. What neither of them knew was just how far-reaching the consequences of this encounter would be, and how it would alter the course of their lives in ways they couldn't have imagined. The precinct was unusually quiet after the incident. The tension hung in the air like a storm cloud, thick and heavy, with every officer in the room painfully aware of what had just transpired. Rick Callahan's fist had connected with Maya Jackson's face in a moment of unchecked anger, and though the room was filled with witnesses, not a single voice had risen to stop him or question what had just occurred. Maya stood still, her hand resting lightly on her cheek, as if testing the depth of the wound, her eyes locked on Rick's with a calm intensity that unnerved him more than any outburst could have. He expected anger, shouting, maybe even fear. But what he saw in her gaze was something different entirely: resolve. And that scared him. Rick turned away from her with a huff, barking orders at the officers around him, his voice louder than necessary. He was trying to reassert control over the room, to remind everyone that he was the one in charge. But the authority in his tone rang hollow, and even he could sense the shift in the atmosphere. Officers avoided his gaze, busying themselves with paperwork or pretending to examine files. No one dared to speak up, but the silence was its own form of indictment. Maya, meanwhile, stood her ground. She wasn't going to give Rick the satisfaction of seeing her shaken. She knew better than to let him control the narrative, and she wasn't about to let this moment define her. She turned to the officer nearest her, a younger man who looked more uncomfortable than anyone else in the room. "I'd like to make a formal complaint," she said, her voice steady and calm. "Where do I start?" The officer fumbled, glancing nervously at Rick before mumbling something about needing to check the protocol. It was clear he didn't know how to handle the situation, or perhaps he simply didn't want to. Rick cut in before the officer could say anything else, his voice dripping with condescension. "There's no need for all that," he said, stepping closer to Maya. "This is just a misunderstanding, isn't it? Let's not make a big deal out of nothing." Maya's eyes narrowed, but her voice remained steady. "Assaulting someone in custody is hardly nothing, Officer Callahan. I'll be filing a formal complaint, whether you like it or not." Rick smirked, his confidence returning as he leaned in closer to her. "Go ahead," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "File your little complaint. See where it gets you. You think anyone here is going to back you up?" Maya didn't flinch. She didn't rise to his bait. Instead, she met his gaze with an unwavering calm that made his smirk falter. "We'll see," she said simply, her tone laced with a quiet determination that sent a chill down Rick's spine. The hours that followed were a blur of controlled chaos. Maya was eventually released without charges, her paperwork stamped and handed over with a stiffness that betrayed the discomfort of the officers handling it. She walked out of the precinct with her head held high, her calm exterior masking the storm of emotions brewing inside her. Anger, frustration, and a deep sense of resolve swirled within her, each emotion fueling her determination to hold Rick accountable for what he had done. Meanwhile, Rick was already trying to spin the situation in his favor. He called a meeting with his supervisor, framing the incident as a misunderstanding and painting Maya as a difficult and uncooperative suspect. He downplayed the violence, describing it as a necessary use of force to maintain control. But even as he spoke, he could sense that his words weren't landing the way they usually did. His supervisor listened with a frown, his expression unreadable, and Rick felt the first stirrings of unease. By the time Maya's identity as the new chief of police was revealed, the precinct was buzzing with whispers and speculation. The news spread like wildfire, leaving a trail of shock and disbelief in its wake. Officers who had once ignored Maya's presence were now scrambling to remember every detail of the encounter, trying to position themselves on the right side of history. Rick, however, was furious. He felt blindsided, betrayed, and most of all, threatened. In the days that followed, the tension in the precinct only grew. Maya's arrival as the new chief was met with a mix of cautious optimism and outright hostility. Some officers welcomed her leadership, recognizing the need for change, while others, Rick among them, resented her presence and the scrutiny it brought. Maya, for her part, remained professional and focused, but she couldn't ignore the undercurrent of resistance she faced. Rick didn't bother hiding his disdain for her. He avoided direct confrontation but made his feelings known through passive-aggressive remarks and subtle acts of defiance. He was careful not to cross any lines, at least, not yet. But Maya saw through his tactics. She knew he was testing her, waiting for an opportunity to undermine her authority. Their interactions were tense, each exchange a battle of wills. During a department meeting, Rick interrupted Maya mid-sentence, questioning her judgment on a new policy she was proposing. His tone was respectful enough to avoid outright insubordination, but the challenge in his words was clear. Maya responded with calm professionalism, refusing to let him rattle her, but the tension in the room was palpable. Outside the precinct, Maya began to dig deeper into Rick's history. She reviewed his case files, interviewed officers who had worked with him, and uncovered a pattern of behavior that was deeply troubling. Complaints of excessive force, racially biased policing, and questionable tactics littered his record, but none of them had ever led to serious consequences. The more she uncovered, the more determined she became to hold him accountable, not just for what he had done to her, but for every person he had harmed in the name of authority. Rick, meanwhile, was growing increasingly paranoid. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of his past actions catching up to him. He doubled down on his efforts to discredit Maya, spreading rumors and trying to rally support among the officers who shared his views. But his tactics were becoming increasingly desperate, and even his closest allies were beginning to distance themselves from him. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the precinct to its core. Maya's investigation was nearing its conclusion, and the evidence she had gathered was damning. Rick's facade of control was cracking, his confidence eroding as the reality of his situation became impossible to ignore. The tension between them was a ticking time bomb, each interaction bringing them closer to an inevitable explosion. What would happen when the truth came to light? Would Rick finally face the consequences of his actions, or would he find a way to escape accountability once again? And how far was Maya willing to go to ensure justice was served? The answers lay just ahead, in a climax that would leave no one untouched and redefine the balance of power in the precinct forever. The precinct buzzed with an uneasy energy, the kind that rippled through the walls and echoed in the low murmur of conversations cut short whenever certain people entered the room. Maya Jackson had become a presence impossible to ignore. Her leadership style was firm but fair, and she had quickly started implementing changes that sent waves through the department. Morning briefings now included discussions about bias training and accountability, topics that had previously been avoided like the plague. The tension was especially thick for Rick Callahan, who had spent the past weeks doing everything in his power to maintain a facade of control while his world crumbled beneath him. Rick sat at his desk, staring at the files Maya had requested earlier that morning. His jaw clenched as he flipped through the documents, his mind racing. He knew she was building something against him, piece by meticulous piece, but he didn't know how much she had or how close she was to finishing. The uncertainty was eating away at him, making him short-tempered and restless. His confidence, the arrogance he once wore like armor, was slipping, and it showed. Colleagues who used to laugh at his jokes now avoided his gaze, and even the officers who had once supported him were starting to keep their distance. The knock at his door startled him. He glanced up to see Maya standing there, her expression calm but unreadable. She didn't wait for an invitation, stepping inside with a deliberate confidence that only irritated him further. She carried a folder under her arm, its contents hidden but clearly significant. Rick leaned back in his chair, forcing a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Chief Jackson," he said, his tone dripping with feigned politeness. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Maya closed the door behind her, letting the sound of it clicking shut fill the room. She didn't sit down, instead standing with her back straight, the folder still clutched in her hand. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady and authoritative. "About your conduct, Officer Callahan." Rick's smirk faltered for a split second before he recovered. "My conduct," he repeated, leaning forward slightly. "I wasn't aware there was an issue. Care to elaborate?" Maya opened the folder, pulling out a single sheet of paper and setting it on his desk. It was a formal complaint, signed and dated. His name was printed clearly at the top, followed by a detailed account of the incident that had started it all. Rick's expression darkened as he scanned the page, his fingers tightening around the edges. "This is what this is about?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You're still holding on to that?" "I told you, it was a misunderstanding. A lapse in judgment, if you want to call it that, but nothing more." Maya didn't flinch. "It wasn't a misunderstanding," she said firmly. "It was an abuse of power. And it's not the first time." Rick's eyes snapped up to meet hers, his jaw tightening. "You don't know what you're talking about." Maya's expression didn't waver. She reached back into the folder and pulled out another document, then another, until a small stack of papers sat between them. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," she said. "These are complaints filed against you over the past 10 years. Excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation. All of them swept under the rug or dismissed outright. But not this time. Rick's face flushed red as he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You're digging up old garbage because you've got a grudge. That's all this is. You think you can come in here and tear me down just because you've got a new title? You don't belong here, and everyone knows it. Maya's gaze remained steady, unshaken by his anger. What I know is that this department has a responsibility to the community it serves, and that starts with accountability. You think you're untouchable, but you're not. Not anymore. Rick pushed back from his desk, standing abruptly. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice low and threatening. You don't know how this place works. You don't know how far people will go to protect their own. Maya raised an eyebrow, her expression cool and unbothered. I'm not afraid of you, Rick, she said. And I'm not afraid of the people who think like you. This stops here. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with finality. Rick's chest rose and fell as he tried to rein in his anger, his mind racing for a way to turn the situation around. But Maya wasn't giving him an inch. She picked up the stack of papers and turned toward the door, her movements deliberate and unhurried. This is just the beginning, she said over her shoulder. I suggest you prepare yourself. She left the room without another word, the door clicking shut behind her. Rick stood there for a long moment, his fists clenched at his sides, his breathing shallow. For the first time, he felt the full weight of the situation pressing down on him, suffocating and inescapable. He had always believed he could talk his way out of anything, manipulate the system to his advantage, but Maya had made it clear that those days were over. The tension in the precinct grew sharper in the days that followed. Maya's investigation moved quickly, her determination driving her to uncover every piece of evidence she could find. Rick's behavior became more erratic, his frustration boiling over in small but noticeable ways. He snapped at colleagues, avoided meetings, and spent long hours in his office, the door always shut. But even as his world fell apart, Rick clung to the belief that he could still find a way to regain control. He had connections, allies who owed him favors, people who could help him bury the truth. At least, that's what he told himself. What he didn't realize was that the people he thought would protect him were already distancing themselves, unwilling to risk their own careers for a man whose downfall seemed inevitable. The moment of reckoning was fast approaching, and everyone in the precinct could feel it. Whispers circulated, speculation ran wild, and the tension in the air was almost unbearable. For Rick, every passing hour brought him closer to the edge, his confidence crumbling under the weight of his own actions. And for Maya, each step forward in her investigation brought her closer to the justice she had been fighting for, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or mistreated under the guise of authority. What neither of them knew was that the truth, once revealed, would send shockwaves through the precinct, shaking the foundation of everything they thought they knew. And when the dust finally settled, nothing would ever be the same. The precinct's conference room was unusually full, the tension in the air so thick it felt like it could snap. Officers sat in stiff chairs around the long table, their expressions a mix of unease and curiosity. Others leaned against the walls, arms crossed, pretending not to notice the tension radiating from one end of the room. Maya stood at the head of the table, her calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions churning beneath the surface. She held a folder in her hands, its edges slightly worn from use. The contents of that folder had become the cornerstone of everything leading to this moment. Rick sat near the middle of the table, his body rigid and his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed his teeth might crack. He hadn't been able to meet Maya's eyes since she walked into the room. For the first time, he wasn't the dominant force in the space, and he knew it. His attempts to rally support had failed, the room's silence was proof enough of that. His allies, those he thought would stand by him, were nowhere to be found, their faces carefully neutral as they avoided even looking in his direction. Maya cleared her throat, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, each word deliberate, carrying a weight that made the room feel smaller. Thank you all for being here. This meeting is not one I take lightly, but it is necessary. What we're about to discuss concerns the integrity of this department, and more importantly, the trust of the community we serve. Rick shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers tapping an uneven rhythm against the table's edge. "Is this really necessary, Chief?" he interrupted, his tone laced with mock politeness. "Seems like you're making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be." Maya's gaze turned to him, sharp and unyielding. Her voice didn't rise, but the steel in her tone was unmistakable. "Yes, Officer Callahan, this is necessary. And I suggest you listen carefully." She set the folder on the table and opened it, spreading out the documents for everyone to see. Her movements were slow, methodical, each paper carrying a story that painted a damning picture. "These are complaints filed against Officer Callahan over the past 10 years, she began, her eyes scanning the room. "Allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation, and abuse of authority. Most of these complaints were dismissed without proper investigation. That stops now." Rick let out a short, humorless laugh, leaning back in his chair with forced nonchalance. "Complaints," he scoffed, his tone dismissive. "Anyone can file a complaint. Doesn't mean they're true." Maya's gaze didn't waver. "You're right. Complaints alone don't prove guilt. But patterns do. And your record shows a pattern that cannot be ignored." Rick's face darkened, the facade of confidence slipping for a moment before he recovered. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped, his voice rising. "You don't know what it's like out there. You sit behind a desk, looking at numbers and files, but you don't see the reality of what we deal with every day." Maya stepped closer to the table, her voice calm but unyielding. "I know exactly what it's like out there, Rick. I've spent my career fighting for people who've been ignored, dismissed, and mistreated by those who were supposed to protect them. I've seen the damage caused by unchecked authority, and I've seen the courage it takes to stand up against it. Don't assume for 1 second that I don't understand." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone like a heavy fog. Rick's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides as he struggled to maintain his composure. "This is a witch hunt," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "You've had it out for me since day one." Maya didn't flinch. "This isn't personal, Rick. This is about accountability. Something this department has ignored for far too long." She pulled out another document, placing it on the table for everyone to see. It was a transcript of the incident, the moment that had set everything into motion. The words were stark, unflinching, a vivid account of Rick's actions and Maya's response. The room seemed to hold its breath as she spoke, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "This is what happens when power goes unchecked," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "This is what happens when we forget that our job is to serve and protect, not intimidate and control. This stops here. Today." Rick's voice cut through the silence, sharp and defensive. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" he spat, his words dripping with venom. "You think you can come in here and fix everything like it's some kind of game? You don't belong here, and you never will." Maya's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not here to be a hero," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here to do my job. To hold this department, and everyone in it, to the standards we should have upheld all along. You don't have to like it, but you will respect it." Rick slammed his hands on the table, rising to his feet. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "You're trying to ruin me over a mistake. A single mistake." Maya's voice remained steady, unshaken by his outburst. "This isn't about a single mistake, Rick. This is about a pattern of behavior that has gone unchecked for too long. And it ends now." The room was silent again, the tension almost unbearable. Rick's face was red with anger, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Maya stood her ground, her presence commanding, unyielding. She turned to the other officers in the room, her voice carrying the weight of everything that had led to this moment. We have a choice to make, she said. Do we continue to turn a blind eye to the problems in this department, or do we take a stand and hold ourselves accountable? Because I can promise you this, change is coming, whether you're ready for it or not. Rick's voice was low, almost a growl. You think you've won, don't you? He said, his tone filled with barely contained rage. But this isn't over. Maya met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. You're right, she said. It's not over. But it's the beginning of the end for people like you. The room was still as the weight of her words settled over everyone. The lines had been drawn, the battle fought, and the balance of power had shifted. Rick's confidence was gone, replaced by the realization that his actions had finally caught up with him. And for Maya, it was a moment of quiet triumph, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. The fallout was inevitable, but the impact of that moment would resonate far beyond the walls of the precinct, setting the stage for a reckoning that would change everything. The aftermath of the meeting rippled through the precinct, leaving an atmosphere that was almost unrecognizable. The power dynamic that had once been so firmly entrenched had shifted in a way no one could ignore. Rick Callahan's outburst, his anger, and his blatant refusal to take accountability had solidified his isolation. Officers who once followed his lead now avoided him, their silence a damning reflection of how far he had fallen. The precinct wasn't a sanctuary for him anymore, it was a battlefield, and he was losing ground with every passing moment. Maya, however, didn't celebrate her progress. She knew better than to assume the fight was over. Winning a battle didn't mean the war was done, and she was keenly aware of the resistance that still simmered beneath the surface. Some officers saw her as an interloper, someone who didn't belong and never would. Others quietly admired her resolve but weren't ready to stand openly by her side. The tension in the air wasn't just about Rick, it was about a system that had long resisted change, now facing the full force of accountability. The days that followed the confrontation were marked by a series of cascading events that kept everyone on edge. The formal investigation into Rick's conduct was launched almost immediately, spearheaded by an independent review board. Maya made it clear that this wasn't just about one man, it was about setting a precedent for how the department handled misconduct moving forward. Her message was unmistakable: no one was above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. Rick, meanwhile, found himself spiraling. The confidence he had once carried like a badge of honor was now a hollow shell, and the cracks in his facade were impossible to ignore. His anger turned inward, festering as he replayed the events of the meeting in his mind. He couldn't believe this was happening to him. He had spent years building his reputation, his career, his authority, and now it was all unraveling because of her. In private, Rick sought allies, but his efforts only highlighted his growing isolation. The officers he approached gave him half-hearted platitudes, carefully worded phrases that avoided taking a side. Some simply nodded and walked away, unwilling to risk their own positions by aligning themselves with him. Rick's frustration mounted with every rejection, feeding into a sense of paranoia that began to consume him. He started to see betrayal everywhere, even in the smallest gestures. Averted eyes became conspiracies. Silence became complicity. He was losing control, and he knew it. Maya, on the other hand, remained focused. She didn't gloat, didn't revel in Rick's downfall. Her approach was methodical, her actions guided by a deep sense of responsibility. She knew the stakes were higher than just one man's career. If she failed to see this through, if she faltered under the pressure, it wouldn't just be her credibility on the line, it would be the trust of the community she had sworn to serve. She couldn't afford to let personal feelings cloud her judgment. This was bigger than her, bigger than Rick. It was about proving that change was possible, even in a system that seemed determined to resist it. The investigation unearthed more than anyone had anticipated. Complaints that had been buried, witnesses who had been silenced, evidence that had been ignored, all of it began to surface, painting a picture that was as damning as it was undeniable. Rick's pattern of behavior wasn't just a series of isolated incidents. It was a symptom of a larger problem, one that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The review board's findings were clear, and the recommendations they made were decisive. Termination. Criminal charges. Public accountability. The announcement hit the precinct like a bomb. Officers gathered in small clusters, whispering among themselves as the news spread. Some were shocked by the severity of the consequences, while others felt a quiet sense of relief that something was finally being done. Rick, however, was livid. The walls of his office seemed to close in around him as he read the report, his hands trembling with rage. He couldn't believe it had come to this. To him, this wasn't justice, it was a vendetta. Maya had made it her mission to destroy him, and now she was winning. But beneath his anger was something else, something he didn't want to admit to himself. Fear. For the first time in his career, Rick was truly afraid. Afraid of losing everything he had built, afraid of what people would say, afraid of facing the consequences of his actions. He had always thought of himself as untouchable, invincible. Now, that illusion was shattered, and he didn't know how to cope with the reality staring him in the face. Maya didn't waver in her resolve, but the weight of the situation wasn't lost on her. She spent long hours reviewing the evidence, meeting with community leaders, and working to ensure that the changes she was implementing would have a lasting impact. She knew there were people who doubted her, people who were waiting for her to fail. But she also knew there were people who believed in her, who were counting on her to succeed. She carried that weight with her every day, using it as fuel to keep going even when the pressure seemed insurmountable. As the days turned into weeks, the precinct began to change. Officers who had once turned a blind eye to misconduct started to speak up. New policies were implemented, policies that prioritized transparency and accountability. Training programs were overhauled, and partnerships with community organizations were strengthened. The changes weren't easy, and there was resistance at every turn, but progress was being made. Slowly but surely, the culture of the precinct began to shift. Rick, meanwhile, faced the reality of his situation. The review board's decision was final, and his termination was imminent. He spent his final days in the precinct in a state of quiet desperation, his once commanding presence reduced to a shadow of its former self. He avoided eye contact, kept his head down, and spoke only when necessary. The man who had once ruled the precinct with an iron fist was now a pariah, his downfall a cautionary tale for everyone who had watched it unfold. Maya didn't gloat when Rick's termination was announced. She didn't make a spectacle of it, didn't revel in his humiliation. She simply did her job, knowing that this was just one step in a much larger journey. But even as she remained focused on the work ahead, she couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The man who had tried to silence her, to intimidate her, to break her, was finally being held accountable. And while it didn't erase the harm he had caused, it was a start. The precinct was quiet that evening, the weight of the day's events hanging heavy in the air. Maya sat in her office, the glow of her desk lamp casting a warm light on the papers scattered in front of her. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with thoughts of everything that had led to this moment. There was still so much work to be done, so many battles left to fight. But for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to breathe, to feel the weight of the victory she had earned. It wasn't the end of the story, far from it. But it was a moment she would carry with her, a reminder of what was possible when you refused to back down. Rick's footsteps echoed faintly against the cold, tiled floor of the precinct as he walked toward the locker room. The once familiar space now felt foreign, almost hostile. Each step seemed to weigh more than the last, the silence pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. The halls, usually alive with conversations, the shuffle of papers, and the constant buzz of activity, were now eerily quiet. It was late. Most of the officers had left, eager to escape the heavy air of tension that had settled over the precinct in the wake of his public unraveling. He reached the locker room door and hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering just above the handle. His mind swirled with thoughts he couldn't quite silence, fragments of anger, shame, and confusion clashing together in a chaotic storm. He had spent years walking these halls with confidence, often arrogance, believing that the badge on his chest granted him authority beyond reproach. Now, that badge felt like a weight pulling him under. He pushed open the door, the hinges creaking softly, and stepped inside. The locker room was dimly lit, the fluorescent bulbs above flickering faintly, as if even the lights couldn't summon the energy to shine fully. Rows of metal lockers stood like silent sentinels, their paint scratched and faded from years of use. Rick walked to his locker, his movements slow and deliberate, and stopped in front of it. The number, 47, was etched onto the surface in peeling white paint, a small reminder of how many years this precinct had existed and how many people had passed through its doors. He reached for the lock, his hands trembling slightly, and turned the combination with an almost mechanical precision. When the door swung open, he was met with the sparse collection of personal belongings he had accumulated over the years. A few framed photos, one of his family from years ago, another of him shaking hands with a superior after a commendation. A worn coffee mug with the precinct's faded logo sat on the top shelf, next to a crumpled piece of paper he didn't bother to inspect. A spare uniform hung neatly on the hook inside, its creases sharp and unworn, a stark contrast to the disheveled man standing before it. Rick stared at the contents for a long moment, his chest tightening as a wave of emotions crashed over him. This wasn't just the end of a job, it was the end of the identity he had clung to for so long. The badge, the uniform, the authority, they had defined him, given him a purpose, a sense of control. And now it was all gone, slipping through his fingers like sand. The sound of the locker room door opening startled him, pulling him out of his thoughts. He turned quickly, his expression shifting from vulnerability to irritation in an instant. Maya Jackson stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dim light behind her. She didn't move at first, letting the silence stretch between them as she assessed him. Her face was calm, unreadable, but her eyes carried an intensity that Rick couldn't ignore. He straightened his posture, trying to reclaim some semblance of control, and spoke first. "You've made your point," he said, his voice low and rough, betraying the exhaustion he couldn't fully hide. "What more do you want?" Maya stepped into the room, her footsteps steady and deliberate as she approached him. She stopped a few feet away, maintaining a professional distance, her expression unwavering. "This isn't about what I want, Rick," she said, her tone even but firm. "It's about what's right. You've spent years avoiding accountability, brushing off complaints, using your badge to shield yourself from consequences. That ends now. This is about justice, not revenge." Rick let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as he leaned against the lockers. The sound echoed faintly in the room, hollow and sharp. "Justice," he muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think that's what this is? Don't kid yourself. This is personal. You've been gunning for me since the day you walked in here." Maya didn't flinch at his accusation. Her eyes remained locked on his, steady and unyielding. "This isn't personal," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "If it were, I would have let my emotions get the better of me weeks ago. But I didn't. I followed the evidence, Rick. I followed the rules. You're not here because of me. You're here because of your choices." Rick's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. His breathing grew shallow as the words sunk in, each one hitting him like a hammer. "You don't understand," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "You think you know what it's like to do this job, to make the hard calls, to deal with the things we deal with every day. But you don't. You've never been in the situations I've been in. You've never had to make the choices I've made." Maya took a step closer, her voice dropping slightly, carrying a weight that made Rick's defensiveness falter. "You're right," she said softly. "I haven't made the choices you've made. But I've been in the same situations, faced the same dangers, and worked in the same system. The difference is, I didn't let those things turn me into someone who abuses their power. You made those choices, Rick. No one else. Rick opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. For a moment, the mask he had been wearing for years, the mask of confidence, authority, invincibility, slipped, revealing the fear and uncertainty beneath. He shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. And what now? What am I supposed to do now? Maya's expression softened, just slightly, as she considered his question. That's up to you, she said after a moment. You can keep blaming everyone else, keep making excuses for what you've done. Or you can take a hard look at yourself and decide to be better. It's not too late, Rick. You've lost this job, but you haven't lost the chance to make things right. Rick didn't respond. He couldn't. He stood there, staring at her, as her words settled over him like a weight he couldn't shake. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full scope of what he had done, the harm he had caused, the trust he had broken, the lives he had affected. It was overwhelming, suffocating, but it was also undeniable. Maya turned to leave, her footsteps echoing softly in the quiet room. She paused at the door, glancing back at him with a look that was equal parts stern and compassionate. This doesn't have to be the end for you, she said. But what happens next is up to you. She walked out without another word, leaving Rick alone in the dimly lit room. He stared at the empty doorway for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. Then, slowly, he turned back to his locker, his movements heavy with the weight of everything that had transpired. He reached for the items inside, one by one, each object a reminder of what he had lost, and what he still had the power to change. Rick sat in the driver's seat of his car, parked in the farthest corner of the precinct lot. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of rain that had started to fall in a soft drizzle. He stared through the windshield, watching the water bead and streak across the glass, distorting the faint glow of the streetlights. His hands rested on the steering wheel, motionless, as though letting go might cause him to fall apart entirely. He hadn't turned the engine on yet. It felt final in a way he wasn't ready to face, as though leaving the lot would solidify everything that had happened, forcing him to confront the reality he was desperately trying to avoid. The past few weeks had unraveled him in ways he hadn't thought possible. His confidence, his sense of control, his identity, it had all been stripped away, leaving him with nothing but questions he wasn't ready to answer. He thought about Maya's words, the calm certainty in her voice as she told him this didn't have to be the end. He hated how much they lingered in his mind, pressing against the walls he had built to protect himself. She had spoken with such conviction, such clarity, that it had been impossible to ignore. And that infuriated him. Because deep down, he knew she was right. A sharp knock on the passenger window jolted him out of his thoughts. He turned his head to see one of his few remaining allies in the precinct, Officer Ben Harper, standing in the rain with an umbrella tilted awkwardly to shield himself. Rick hesitated for a moment before reaching over to unlock the door. Ben slid into the seat, shaking the water from his jacket as he settled in. "You're still here," Ben said, his tone carefully neutral, though his eyes were filled with something that looked like pity. "I figured you'd be long gone by now." Rick shrugged, his hands tightening on the wheel. "Just needed a minute," he muttered, his voice rough. "Didn't feel like rushing out." Ben nodded slowly, the silence stretching between them. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and glanced over at Rick. "You okay?" he asked, though the question sounded more like an obligation than genuine concern. Rick let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "What do you think, Ben? Does this look like someone who's okay?" Ben sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, man, I don't know what to say. This whole thing, it's a mess. But you knew it was coming. You had to." Rick turned to him, his eyes flashing with anger. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ben raised his hands in a placating gesture. "It means you've been skating on thin ice for years, Rick. We all knew it. Hell, you knew it. And now it's finally caught up with you. Rick clenched his jaw, his grip on the wheel tightening until his knuckles turned white. "You think I deserve this?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Ben hesitated, the weight of the question hanging heavily in the air. I think you made choices, Rick. Choices that had consequences. And now you're facing them." Rick stared at him for a long moment, his expression a mix of anger, frustration, and something else, something closer to pain. "You're supposed to be my friend," he said finally, his voice cracking slightly. "I am your friend," Ben replied, his tone firm. "And as your friend, I'm telling you the truth. You screwed up, Rick. You let your anger, your arrogance, whatever the hell it was, get the better of you. And now you're paying the price. But that doesn't mean it's over. You can still what?" Rick interrupted, his voice rising. "Still fix it. Still make it right. It's too late, Ben. They've already made up their minds. I'm done." Ben shook his head, his expression softening. "It's not about them, Rick. It's about you. You can't undo what's already been done, but you can decide what kind of person you're gonna be moving forward. That's the only thing you've got left. Don't waste it." Rick looked away, his gaze returning to the rain-streaked windshield. He didn't respond, his thoughts swirling too fast to form words. Ben sat back, letting the silence stretch between them once again. After a long moment, Rick spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted, the vulnerability in his tone catching Ben off guard. "I don't even know where to start." Ben placed a hand on Rick's shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "One step at a time," he said simply. "It's not gonna be easy. Hell, it's gonna be the hardest thing you've ever done. But if you really want to change, it's worth it." Rick didn't respond immediately, his mind racing as he considered Ben's words. He thought about everything that had led him to this moment, the choices he had made, the people he had hurt, the man he had become. He thought about Maya, the way she had looked at him with a mix of disappointment and determination, her words cutting through the defenses he had built around himself. And for the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she was right. The sound of the rain intensified, the steady rhythm filling the car as the two men sat in silence. Finally, Rick turned to Ben, his expression softer than it had been in weeks. "Thanks," he said quietly, the word carrying more weight than he expected. Ben nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Anytime." As Ben opened the car door and stepped out into the rain, Rick watched him go, his mind still heavy with unanswered questions. He didn't have all the answers yet, he wasn't even sure he wanted them. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him. It wasn't hope, not exactly, but it was close. And that was enough to make him turn the key in the ignition, the sound of the engine breaking the silence as he prepared to take the first step forward. Months later, the precinct was unrecognizable. The tension that once poisoned the air had been replaced by a sense of purpose. The culture shift Maya had fought so hard to implement was finally taking root. Officers underwent rigorous training, not just in law enforcement but in community engagement and cultural competency. Old habits didn't die easily, but Maya had made it clear that change wasn't optional. Slowly but surely, those who resisted either adapted or found themselves leaving the force altogether. The precinct wasn't perfect, there was still work to do, but for the first time in years, it felt like a place where progress was possible. Rick Callahan had disappeared from the public eye after his termination. Whispers about his fall from grace circulated in certain circles, but most people had moved on, their attention drawn to other stories, other scandals. For Rick, the months that followed his departure were some of the darkest of his life. The man who once walked with an air of unshakable confidence now found himself questioning everything. Without the badge, without the authority he had relied on for so long, he felt hollow, unsure of who he was or what he was supposed to do next. The first few weeks were the hardest. He avoided people, ignored calls, and spent most of his days replaying the events that led to his downfall. Anger and bitterness consumed him at first, directed at Maya, at the system, at anyone but himself. But eventually, the anger burned itself out, leaving behind a painful clarity. He couldn't escape the truth anymore. He had done this to himself. The choices he made, the power he abused, the people he hurt, it all came back to him. One day, almost on a whim, Rick found himself walking into a local community center. The building was modest, with peeling paint and a faint smell of disinfectant, but it buzzed with activity. Children laughed as they played basketball in the gym, and a group of women sat in a circle, knitting and chatting. Rick felt out of place, awkward and unsure, but something pulled him inside. He approached the front desk and asked if there was anything he could do to help. The woman behind the counter looked at him skeptically, her eyes narrowing as she recognized him. But after a long pause, she handed him a clipboard and told him they needed volunteers for their youth mentorship program. It wasn't easy. The first few sessions were filled with mistrust and skepticism. The kids didn't trust him, and he didn't blame them. He saw the way they looked at him, their eyes filled with the same suspicion he had once dismissed as unwarranted. But he kept showing up, week after week, determined to earn their trust. Slowly, he began to connect with them, sharing stories of his past mistakes and the lessons he was trying to learn. For the first time in years, Rick felt like he was doing something meaningful, something that wasn't about power or authority but about giving back. Maya heard about Rick's work through a mutual connection. She hadn't thought about him much since his departure, her focus consumed by the challenges of leading the precinct. When she learned what he was doing, she was surprised, though she kept her thoughts to herself. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. She didn't reach out to him, choosing instead to let him find his path on his own terms. Meanwhile, Maya's work at the precinct continued to bear fruit. She had implemented new systems of accountability, ensuring that complaints were thoroughly investigated and that officers who abused their power faced real consequences. The community, once distrustful and wary, began to see the precinct as a partner rather than an adversary. Maya made it a point to attend town halls, listen to residents' concerns, and engage with people who had every reason to distrust law enforcement. She knew trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, but she was committed to the process. One afternoon, as she walked through the precinct, she passed by the break room and overheard a group of officers talking. They were discussing a recent incident where a senior officer had intervened to stop a younger officer from using excessive force during an arrest. The senior officer had followed the protocols Maya had put in place, de-escalating the situation and ensuring the suspect was treated fairly. The officers in the break room spoke with admiration, recognizing the impact of the new leadership. Maya felt a flicker of pride but didn't stop to join the conversation. Her work wasn't done yet. Months later, at a community event hosted by the precinct, Rick and Maya crossed paths for the first time since his termination. Rick had been invited by one of the kids he mentored, a young boy who had insisted he come to watch him receive an award for academic improvement. Rick had hesitated at first, unsure if he could face Maya or anyone else from the precinct. But he came anyway, sitting quietly in the back of the room as the event unfolded. When Maya spotted him, she felt a mix of emotions, surprise, curiosity, and a twinge of something she couldn't quite name. She approached him after the event, her posture calm and composed. Rick stood as she neared, his expression uncertain but open. "Chief Jackson," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "Maya," she corrected, offering a small smile. "It's good to see you." Rick hesitated, then nodded. "You too." They talked briefly, their conversation polite but genuine. Rick told her about his work at the community center, his voice tinged with both pride and humility. Maya listened, her expression thoughtful. She didn't offer absolution or forgiveness, those were things Rick would have to earn in his own time. But as they parted ways, she extended her hand, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. Rick shook it, feeling a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. The precinct, the community center, the people, they were all part of a story that didn't end that day. Change was a process, not a destination. Maya continued her work, balancing the challenges of leadership with the hope of a better future. Rick kept showing up at the community center, finding purpose in small victories and the trust he was slowly earning. Neither of them was the same person they had been at the beginning of this journey, and that was the point. This story isn't just about a fall from grace or a fight for justice. It's about the choices we make and the paths we take when confronted with the truth of who we are. It's about accountability, redemption, and the power of change, not just in systems, but in ourselves. What would you do if faced with the same choices as Rick or Maya? Would you fight for what's right, even when it's hard? Would you take the steps to rebuild, even when it feels impossible? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's start a conversation about the power of accountability, the possibility of redemption, and the hope for a better future. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, engage, and surprise. Hit that like button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Thank you for joining us on this journey. See you next time.